I never thought I would set foot in the cottage again. Not the way things ended. Not after I stood in the November cold at a cemetery in Gravenhurst and watched them lower my son into frozen Ontario ground. The cottage had been Owen's idea, not mine. He had spotted the listing on a Saturday afternoon and called me on my cell before he had even finished reading the description. He said, "Dad, this is the one." I could hear it in his voice, that particular kind of certainty he had carried since he was 9 years old, and decided something was worth wanting. I drove up with him the following weekend. We walked the dock together in our rubber boots, looked out at the gray November water of Lake Muskoka, and I did not say a single word against it because I could see what he saw. He was 36 years old and he had found his place in the world. I helped him negotiate the purchase. I helped him carry furniture up the narrow staircase on a hot July afternoon. I sat on the dock with him the first summer he owned it, and we drank coffee and watched a loon surface and dive and surface again. And I thought, this is what a man's life is supposed to look like when it is going right. That was 3 years before I got the Hydro 1 notice in the mail. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Guelph on a Wednesday morning in late February, working through a stack of envelopes I had been putting off since the weekend. There is something about grief that makes even small tasks feel enormous. The pile had been sitting there for 4 days. I had been telling myself I would get to it. I was on my second cup of coffee when I pulled out the statement. It was a Hydro 1 bill, forwarded from the Muskoka address, addressed to the estate of Owen Callahan, care of me. The account balance was $312. The billing period covered the previous 2 months. I set the mug down very carefully. The cottage had been sitting empty since Owen died. That was what my daughter-in-law had told me when I called her 6 weeks after the funeral to ask what she wanted to do about the property. She had been quiet for a long moment on the phone before she said that she simply could not think about it yet. She said the cottage was so completely Owen that she did not know how she would ever walk through the door again without breaking apart. I told her to take all the time she needed. I told her we would figure it out together when she was ready. I had waited 16 months. Someone had been running up a $300 hydro bill at a cottage that was supposed to be locked and dark. I put the statement in my jacket pocket, found my keys, and drove the 140 kilometers to Muskoka without telling a single person where I was going. I want to tell you about my son before I tell you what I found, because you need to understand what kind of man Owen was before any of the rest of this makes sense. Owen was 38 years old when he died. He was the sort of person who remembered the names of your children and asked about them specifically the next time he saw you, not in a polished way, not in the way of someone performing warmth, but because he genuinely wanted to know. He had studied environmental engineering at the University of Waterloo and had spent most of his career working on watershed restoration projects in southern Ontario. He believed in things. He believed in leaving places better than you found them, in making decisions slowly and carrying them out carefully. He had my late wife's patience and a stubbornness that was entirely his own. He married a woman named Claire when he was 31. She was sharp and organized and socially confident in all the ways that Owen tended to be quiet and careful. I had always thought they balanced each other well. He died 20 months ago in what the coroner called an accidental fall during a solo hiking trip in Algonquin Park. He had gone up for a long weekend in early October, the way he often did in autumn when the colors were at their best. His body was found 3 days later on a rocky slope below a trail he knew well. The report said he had likely slipped on wet leaves near the edge and fallen approximately 9 meters. They said it was consistent with an accident. The investigation was closed within 2 weeks. I was 64 years old and I had lost my wife to a stroke 4 years earlier, and now my only child was gone, and the particular silence that settled into my house in Guelph after the funeral was like nothing I had ever tried to live inside. Claire managed the immediate aftermath with a calm efficiency I told myself was just how she handled difficulty. She coordinated with the funeral home. She dealt with the Parks Authority. She communicated with Owen's employer and his insurance company. She arranged the reception after the service and made sure there was food and that people had somewhere to sit. I remember being grateful for her. I remember thinking that Owen had chosen someone capable, and that capable was something I needed in those weeks. Now I was driving north on the 400 with a hydro bill in my pocket and something cold and old settling into my chest. I turned off Highway 11 onto the township road and drove the last 4 kilometers with my headlights off, not because I had planned to do it that way. Old instinct, I had driven that road in the dark 100 times, visiting Owen, and I knew every turn. I pulled onto the shoulder about 200 meters before the driveway and sat with the engine off and looked toward the tree line. There were lights on in the cottage. Not one light. The living room windows were lit, the porch fixture above the front door was on, and I could see the blue-white glow of a television reflecting off the ceiling through the window above the sink. I sat there for a long moment. Then I remembered something. Owen had installed a smart home system the previous spring. Ring cameras, front door, and back deck, plus a wide-angle unit covering the driveway and the dock. He had called me about it on a Sunday afternoon, walking me through the setup over video call, showing me the angles, explaining how the footage saved to the cloud automatically, how I could check in on the property from anywhere. He had given me the login information and made me write it down in the small notebook I keep in the drawer beside the stove. Because I had once spent 11 days locked out of my own Rogers account and Owen had never fully forgiven me for not writing things down. I did not walk up the driveway. I sat in my car in the dark on the shoulder of a township road in the middle of February, and I opened the app on my phone and I logged into my son's camera account. The driveway camera loaded first. There was a black SUV parked where Owen used to park his, a newer model I did not recognize, with Quebec plates. The back deck camera showed 2 pairs of winter boots on the mat outside the door. The front door camera showed a wreath hanging where Owen had always hung his mother's old brass knocker. The wreath had white ribbon and little wooden snowflakes. It was the kind of thing someone hangs when they have decided a place belongs to them. I switched to the recorded footage. I scrolled back 16 months, and I sat on the shoulder of that road, and I watched through a 4-inch screen as my daughter-in-law brought another man into my son's cottage for the first time, approximately 6 weeks after Owen's funeral. His name, I would learn later, was Martin. He was broad-shouldered and somewhere in his mid-40s, with close-cropped dark hair and a way of moving through a space that suggested he had no concerns about his right to be there. In the footage, I watched him carry groceries into Owen's kitchen. I watched him sit in Owen's chair on the back deck and drink what appeared to be a beer while looking out at the lake my son had loved. I watched him sand and restain the dock boards one weekend in early May. Owen's dock, using Owen's tools from the small shed my son had organized with the kind of methodical care he brought to everything. I watched Claire show him something on her phone and laugh. It was the first time I had seen her laugh since the funeral. I watched all of this for just over an hour, sitting alone in the dark in my car, and I did not start the engine. Then I drove home to Guelph, and I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad I use for grocery lists, and I began writing down everything I needed to understand. Owen's estate had not been fully settled. There had been complications around the cottage title specifically, which Claire had explained to me, during a conversation the previous spring, was taking longer than expected because of how the deed was structured. She had said her lawyer was handling it. She had said these things take time. I had not pushed because I did not want to be the grieving father-in-law who made a difficult situation more difficult. The cottage deed, as I understood it from when Owen had purchased the property, listed Owen as the sole owner. Claire's name had been added 6 months after the purchase at Owen's request, making it jointly held. Under Ontario law, joint tenancy carries a right of survivorship, which means the surviving owner typically inherits the other's share automatically. I knew this. I had known it since Owen added her name to the title. What I did not know was what else had been happening in the 16 months since my son's death. The next morning I called a lawyer. Not the one I had used for my own affairs, but someone recommended to me by an old colleague who had gone through a contested estate with his siblings a decade ago. Her name was Patricia, and she had 30 years of experience in estate litigation in Ontario. I drove to her office in Kitchener that afternoon and I told her everything. I told her about the hydro bill, about the footage, about the Quebec plates and the wreath on the door. I told her about 16 months of silence from Claire on the question of the estate. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do not contact Claire. Do not let her know what you have seen. Send me every clip from those cameras and give me access to whatever estate documents you have." I sent her 68 video files that evening. Over the following 3 weeks, Patricia and her associate found a number of things I had not expected. Things that went well beyond a man with Quebec plates sleeping in my son's cottage. The property insurance on the cottage had been quietly converted from a joint policy in both names to a policy listing Claire as sole owner, with a notation that the co-owner had died and the property had transferred via survivorship. This was technically correct under the joint tenancy clause. However, other changes were not so clean. The Rogers Internet account for the cottage, which had been in the estate's name during the probate process, had been transferred into Claire's personal name 9 months ago, before the estate had been formally administered and before the estate trustee, which was me, had authorized any transfers. The municipal property tax account had similarly been updated to show Claire as sole owner, with documentation submitted to the township that Patricia said had been filed without my knowledge or involvement as the named estate trustee in Owen's will. There was more. Patricia found that a home equity line of credit on the cottage property had been opened 8 months after Owen's death. The application had been filed using documentation that listed the estate as a co-applicant in a way that appeared to require the consent of the estate trustee, consent which had never been sought or given. $17,000 had been drawn against that line of credit in the following 6 months. Patricia had a preliminary sense of where some of those funds had gone, and she wanted another week to confirm before she told me. I did not sleep well in those weeks. I want to be honest about that. I sat in my kitchen at 2 a.m. more than once, and I thought about things I was not ready to say out loud to anyone. I thought about Owen's hiking trip. I thought about a man who was methodical and careful and who knew Algonquin Park the way he knew the layout of his own cottage. Every trail, every grade change, every place where the rock was slick in the rain. I thought about a trail he had walked a dozen times and a slope he was supposed to have slipped on in the early morning when the leaves were wet. I thought about the fact that Claire had not gone with him that weekend, even though she had gone on several previous October trips. She had told me at the time that she had a work commitment she could not reschedule. I did not say any of this to Patricia, not yet. Some things you carry alone until you are certain enough of the weight to hand them to someone else. What I said to Patricia was, I want every unauthorized action taken against this estate documented completely. I want to know exactly what was drawn against that line of credit and where it went. And I want to know every remedy available to me under Ontario law. She said, give me 2 more weeks. She came back in 11 days. The $17,000 drawn on the home equity line had gone in 3 separate transfers to a joint checking account held by Claire and a man whose name appeared on the account alongside hers. The account had been opened 4 months after Owen's death. The man's name on that account was Martin Bouchard. He had a Quebec driver's license and a Montreal address and had, according to Patricia's research, been connected to Claire professionally for several years before Owen died. Patricia found photographs on a now deleted social media account, archived through a third-party tool, showing Claire and Martin at a restaurant in Ottawa, the 2 of them across a table with wine glasses, a photo taken 13 months before Owen's hiking trip. The caption had been removed, but the metadata timestamp remained. I went outside when Patricia finished telling me this. I stood on my back step in the March cold and I looked at the bare trees in my yard for a long time. The sky was the flat gray that settles over southern Ontario in late winter and does not lift for weeks. I thought about a man who restored watersheds for a living because he believed in leaving things better than he found them. I went back inside and I called Patricia and I asked her how long it would take to file. 2 more weeks, she said. I gave her 12 days. In those 12 days, I drove up to Muskoka twice more. Both times I parked on the shoulder and I did not go to the door. The first time I went in the early morning, just before dawn, and I sat and watched through the car window as the lights came on one by one, and Martin came out in a heavy coat to start the black SUV and let it warm up in the driveway before he went back inside. He stood there for a moment and looked out at the lake. He stood there with his coffee and he looked at my son's lake like a man deciding whether he liked what he owned. The second time I brought my good camera, and I walked the property line through the tree line on the west side, staying in the bush, moving quietly the way my son had taught me when we used to walk in the early morning looking for deer. Owen had known every deer path on that property. He had shown me each of them over the years, the way a man shows you the things he loves. I took photographs of the property, of the dock, of the shed where Owen's tools still hung on the pegboard inside, organized exactly the way he had always kept them. I found something at the dock I had not expected. Tied to the far cleat, covered with a blue tarp that had come loose at one corner, was a watercraft I did not recognize. A Sea-Doo, newer model, red. I pulled the tarp back enough to read the hull. I photographed the registration sticker on the side. Patricia ran the hull number. The Sea-Doo had been registered to Claire Callahan 4 months ago. Purchased through a dealership in Bracebridge for $11,200. The payment had been processed through an account that Patricia was still tracing, but her initial findings suggested the funds had come from the same home equity line of credit. She had used the equity in my dead son's property to buy herself a Sea-Doo. She had tied it to his dock and covered it with a tarp, and she had spent 16 months telling me she was too heartbroken to think about the cottage. Patricia called me the day after she confirmed this, and her voice had that particular flatness that lawyers get when they have finished building something they are confident in. She said, "I think we are ready to proceed." I said, "Then let's proceed." The process that followed I will not describe in its full legal detail, partly because some of it remains ongoing and partly because it is genuinely tedious in a way that a story like this does not need. What matters is what happened when Patricia filed. She sent a formal notice to Claire's solicitor outlining every finding: the unauthorized conversion of estate accounts, the home equity line opened without trustee consent, the $17,000 transferred to a joint account with a man who had been photographed with Claire 13 months before my son's death, the Sea-Doo purchased with what appeared to be estate funds, the 68 time-stamped camera recordings spanning 16 months. The notice included a demand to freeze all estate assets pending a full accounting, a demand to vacate the Muskoka property within 60 days, and notification that a formal application had been filed with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice for an estate audit and the replacement of the existing administrative arrangements with a court-appointed trustee. I was told Claire received the notice on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, her solicitor had called Patricia. By Friday evening, Claire herself had called my number. I let it ring through to voicemail. I sat at the kitchen table where I had opened the Hydra bill 2 months earlier, and I listened to her message in full. It was 3 minutes and 50 seconds long. She started by saying my name twice, the way she always had, the way that had once made me feel like family. She said she knew this must look bad. She said there were things I didn't understand. She said Martin was just a friend who had been helping her. She said she had been so lost without Owen, and that she hadn't been thinking clearly, and that she had never meant to hurt anyone. When the message ended, I set my phone down face up on the table and I looked at the ceiling for a while. Then I poured a glass of water and went to bed. The hearing before the court was 7 weeks later. I want to tell you about that morning because it is the part I come back to most often when I am sitting in that same kitchen chair late at night. The judge was a man in his late 50s with reading glasses and the expression of someone who has heard a great deal and is not easily surprised. Patricia presented everything in sequence and without drama, which I appreciated: the camera footage, the financial records, the Sea-Doo registration, the archived social media photograph with the metadata timestamp. Claire sat across the room with her solicitor and kept her face very still and her hands flat on the table in front of her. Martin was not in the courtroom. I had not expected him to be. At one point, the judge looked up from the home equity documents and looked at Patricia and asked a clarifying question about the timeline of the account opening relative to the estate administration process. Patricia answered clearly and specifically. The judge wrote something down and did not look up again for a long moment. Then he said, "For the record, the estate trustee was not notified of or consulted on this application." Patricia said, "That is correct, Your Honor. That is correct." The ruling came 9 days later. The home equity line of credit was frozen immediately pending a full audit by a court-appointed trustee. The property tax and insurance records were ordered restored to reflect the estate's proper administrative status. Claire was ordered to provide a full accounting of all estate funds handled or transferred since Owen's death, and to vacate the Muskoka property within 45 days. The Sea-Doo was to be considered part of the estate inventory pending determination of how it was purchased. Patricia called me with the ruling on a Tuesday afternoon, and I sat in the living room and I looked at the photograph of Owen on the bookshelf, the one from 3 summers ago where he is standing on the dock in his rain jacket with a coffee mug, squinting into the morning light, laughing at something off camera, and I did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, "What about the other thing?" Patricia knew what I meant. I had told her several weeks earlier, not as a formal instruction, but because I needed to say it to someone, about what I had been turning over in the nights. About Owen and Algonquin Park and a hiking trail he knew as well as his own driveway. About a woman who had been photographed with another man a year before the accident and who had not been there that weekend. About the word accident and how it gets applied very quickly and then stops being examined. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is outside of what I do. but there are people whose job that is, and I know who to call. She gave me a number. It was not a police number. I will not say more than that because I do not yet know what it will come to, and because some things need to move at their own pace before you talk about them. I will tell you what came after the legal matter was resolved. Claire vacated the property in late May. She left it in reasonable condition, which surprised me slightly, and took what was hers. The see-do was catalogued by the estate trustee. The home equity audit is still ongoing as of now, and Patricia tells me the accounting will take some time to fully resolve. But the cottage came back to the estate, and the estate, under Owen's will, had a clear provision. If the marriage had dissolved, or if Claire were found to have acted against Owen's interests in a material way, the cottage reverted to his estate and then to me. His solicitor confirmed this when the probate was formally reviewed. Claire had known this. She had known it, and she had moved carefully and quietly, and she had not moved quite quickly enough. She had not counted on the hydro bill being forwarded. She had not counted on Owen's Ring cameras still recording to the cloud. She had not counted on a 64-year-old man sitting in a stack of unread mail on a February morning with enough coffee and enough silence to finally go through the envelopes he had been putting off. The first night I stayed at the cottage after it came back to me. I drove up on a Friday evening in late June, and I sat on Owen's dock in the long northern dusk, and I watched the light go flat across the water. The loons were out. There are always loons on Lake Muskoka in June, and they were calling back and forth across the bay in that sound that is entirely specific to being in the Canadian North at the end of a long day. I had a thermos of tea because coffee keeps me up now, and I sat there until it was fully dark. I had taken down the snowflake wreath from the front door. In its place, I had rehung my wife's old brass knocker that I had kept in a box in my garage in Guelph for 4 years, the one Owen had grown up knocking on before he was tall enough to reach it. It had belonged to my wife's mother originally. Owen had asked me once if he could have it for the cottage. I had told him someday. I had not gotten around to giving it to him before he died. I gave it to him now. The dock boards that Martin had sanded and restained the previous spring were smooth under my feet, and I appreciated the work, even as I felt the particular grief of a stranger's hands on something that should have been left to family. I had found Owen's old green Coleman canoe in the shed, exactly where he had always stored it, hung on the wall brackets he had bolted himself. He had used that canoe every summer since university. There was a long faded scratch along the starboard side from a submerged granite shelf on 3 Mile Lake that we had both agreed was the lake's fault and not the paddlers'. I had not gotten around to repairing it. I was not sure I ever would. I had put it in the water that afternoon, for the first time since Owen died, and paddled out to the middle of the bay and sat there for a while in the way you sit in a canoe when there is no particular destination. I found myself talking to him the way you talk to someone when they are gone and the quiet gets too large to hold alone. I told him about the court ruling. I told him about the brass knocker on the door. I told him that his neighbors at the property to the north, a retired couple from Barrie named Doug and Helen, had come over the previous weekend to introduce themselves properly now that the cottage was back in the family, and that they had said kind things about him, that they remembered him waving from the dock in the mornings, that they had said he was the kind of young man who made you feel good about the next generation. I told him I was sorry it took me 16 months to open the mail. The canoe sat still on the water, and the sky above the lake had gone the particular deep blue of a June night in the north, and the stars were starting and the loons were still calling. I thought about the camera system Owen had installed the previous spring. I thought about how proud he had been of it, walking me through every angle on a video call, making me write down the login information because he knew me and knew I would lose it otherwise. He had no way of knowing what he was leaving me. He had no idea that the footage would back up automatically for 16 months while his cottage was occupied by strangers, accumulating evidence the way snow accumulates overnight, quietly and completely, until you look out the window in the morning and see that the whole world has changed. He had set it up because he was a careful man, because he thought about the future in the practical, methodical way of someone who planned to be here for it. He had left me the tools, and I had found them. Later than I should have, but I had found them. There is still a question I am carrying that does not yet have an answer. There is an inquiry that is moving forward in the way these things move, slowly and without announcement, gathering information the way a good engineer surveys the ground before deciding what can be built and what cannot. I have been told to be patient. Patience is not something I was ever especially good at. But grief teaches you that time does not always move the way you want it to, and that the truth moves on its own schedule entirely. What I will tell you is this: if you have a stack of mail you have been putting off, go through it. If there is a property sitting somewhere with your name attached to it, check on it. If someone you trusted has told you something is being handled and you have never asked for details, ask for the details. The truth does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a $300 hydro bill in a pile of envelopes on a Wednesday morning when you are on your second cup of coffee and the world outside is gray and cold and you are not yet ready to deal with anything. Open it anyway. Go back to the house. Check the cameras. Look at what is actually there. My son was a careful man. He built things to last. He thought about what might be needed before anyone else thought to ask the question. He installed 4 cameras on a cottage in Muskoka one summer afternoon because he was proud of his own work and wanted to show his father every angle. He could not have known, but he gave me exactly what I needed. I am 64 years old and I have been on that dock a dozen times since June, and I will be there again next weekend and the weekend after that for as long as I am able to make the drive north. The loons will be there. The green canoe with the scratch along the starboard side will be there. The brass knocker will be on the door. And when the other question finally has an answer, I will tell you that too. I have learned how to wait.